It's my last day of leave. It's another beautifully sunny day. It's quite hot. But I'm back looking at the guards now, and then try and get as much done today and then start up on them properly again in the weekend. But I'm actually measuring what I ended up with the guards. I initially used a different piece of wood as my compass thing, and I was a bit worried that when I transferred the measurements to this I got it wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is correct. I was quite careful with that. I can't find the first one I made. Not sure what I did with it. I think I might have cut it up to use for something else, but I've drawn out some of the different radiuses on this piece of cardboard. 14 inches is what the outside diameter of the tyre is in the middle of the tyre, and these side strips were cut 14 inches and 16 inches. Interestingly, what's happened is they have shrunk a little bit. So when I've done the rolled edge, you can see it's a little bit, it's almost 14 inches. It's a little bit bigger than 14 inches. And you can see that. You can actually put this on top of the tyre and it fits almost perfectly. So that hasn't lost as much as I expected it would when I took off the 1/2 inch to do the wide edge. And the other thing that's interesting is I've got my squares set up on the 16-inch mark, which is that outer diameter, and you can see it is basically 16 inches, which is why I've never been able to get these to fit, because if it's 16 inches here, then that's only 2 inches above the tyre, so far closer. And that's why I've always been struggling to get these to fit with my 3-inch block. It's never going to work. So these, I'm still not sure if I've just messed up a measurement, or I think I have forgotten to add on something. So if this side piece is 16 inches, then when you curve it round you lose a bit, of course. But then I add a bit more in because I had some crown, so that's why it's ended up coming back to where it should be. Which means if I want that 3-inch height, I have to make these bigger. But I think what I'm going to do is go more than 3 inches. I'll probably go to 4, raise these up to give me plenty of clearance, and I might reduce the side off the sides a little bit. One of the reasons for that is, again, more clearance, and 2, I think that's closer to some of the originals. And I say some of the originals because, as I've mentioned before, these things were all different. And to help show that, my Brooklands book arrived when we were away, actually, but I've been reading that this morning. And it's interesting if you're into these kind of cars. The layout is a little bit confusing, the way it's sort of broken up, and it sort of jumps around a little bit, but there's lots of really interesting information there about how they built these cars and where they came from. There's no detail about physically how they built them. A lot of the records were lost during the war. I think the factory got bombed in like 1940 or something. And the book does make it very clear that these were race cars, and they were bought for racing. So they were bought, they were modified, they were crashed, they were rebuilt. They're all different. So, you know, what I've got here is fine for a Brooklands. From the pictures, it's hard to tell from the pictures. I think in the book they've tried to use as many period pictures as possible, which is really good. I've actually seen most of them before. A lot of them are just floating around. A couple of pictures that I haven't seen before that were really interesting and useful were pictures of the instrument panel. And what I've got here is pretty close. It's not far off, but they have a gauge in here. This is correct, positioning of those is correct, positioning of this is correct, and then they have gauges over here. So, you know, again, what I've got here is pretty period. It's not far off. But back to the guards, it looks from the photos that this is slightly narrower. Not much. It's, again, it depends which style of guard you want to go for and what you're looking at. Interestingly, in the book it does mention that the big long sweeping guards, I'm guessing the ones with the filled in valance piece here, that they quickly stopped using those for racing because they were too flimsy. So again, modifications. I don't think it gives an exact number of how many cars were actually made, because again, that's confusing, and the records have been lost, a lot of them. And there's, like all these old cars, there's been some funny things done where cars change bodies, and sometimes you get the same car with or two different cars with the same chassis numbers, weird things like that. There's not too much of that, but the original numbering seemed to go up to around 100, and then there's a few little bits and pieces here and there with different numbers. So I think it was less than 100. I'll have to go back and reread the book, various bits, and try and figure it out. But the lots of history there. At the back of the book, it does have an appendix with a list of all the known cars and their numbers and registrations, and as much history as they could find for those cars, which is really quite good, quite interesting. So yeah, I think the book is about £95. Shipping to New Zealand wasn't too bad. I think it was another £30 for me, something like that. I'm used to that. So unless you're really into them, it's probably not a book for you. It isn't really much help for someone trying to build a replica, apart from the period photos, but you can find those most other places. But you know, it is interesting. And of course, like all of these sort of cars, things changed over the production history. So the early cars had slightly different braking setup. They had different wheels, different size brakes, 5-stud wheels instead of 6. The early ones had bowed axles, whereas the later ones have the straight axles like this. Just all sorts of changes. But back to the guards. I'm going to figure out what the new radiuses need to be. I think I am just going to stick with straight-sided guards rather than doing the sloping thing on the inside that some of them seem to have, because again, there's so many different styles. You can pick and choose which one you want to put on your car. That's what I'm going to do. And I need to measure those. Those were the original ones I did that I considered to be too big, and these were also narrower. So I think these are 1 3/4, whereas on that I used 2 inches. So 1 3/4 will make the sides slightly shorter, which is what I want. These may actually be correct after all that, or usable. The guards are going to sit higher because of the clearance issue, but they need to at the back anyway, because you need that clearance, the up and down clearance. You know, you need 3-inch blocks, quite handy here. You know, there's about 3 1/8 before that axle. Yeah, 3 1/8, 3 1/4 of an inch upward travel before it hits the stop. So you need at least that, probably a little bit more actually, because of its articulating. Yeah. But that's at like the extremes of travel. So yeah. I also did look up, one of the reasons I popped into Horopito was to look for something suitable to make the high stoplight. Somebody did ask a question in the comments about, is that actually necessary? So I was pretty sure it was, but I went back and checked the actual rules, the actual legislation. Basically, any car that's first registered in New Zealand, regardless of the age of the car, if it's registered after 1st of January 1990, it has to have one. That's the rule. So this car, even though it's a 1930 car, replica, because it's going to be first registered in 2025, I hope, it'll have to have one. So it'll have to go up here somewhere, or here, because it can't be obscured. That's going to be a little bit fiddly, but I'll think of something suitable anyway. Measuring those original sides I made, they're 18-inch outer diameter, which, if the same reasoning happens, that the final dimension ends up being that outer radius, or pretty close, that would give me 4 inches clearance, which I think is going to be enough, which is good because it means I can reuse those pieces I've already cut and I'm not wasting steel. Another quick thing to mention, I talked about changing the shape of the guard so it wasn't a smooth radius and it kicked out more at the ends. I don't need to now. So the reason why I thought I needed to do that is because the radius is wrong. So the ends are too tight because the guards are too far away from the tire and the radius is tighter. That's why it looks like they're pulling in, if that makes sense. If I was to sit these 2 inches above the tire, I think they will look correct. I can try that on the back one actually. So I can just use the plain radius there. That's with a 2-inch spacer. And that now looks pretty much correct. So, yeah, that's what went wrong. I suspect because it had gone wrong a couple of times before when I did these ones, it didn't even occur to me to check what the final radius I ended up with was. So, I think make one more, check that's right before going on to the second one. Before my new toy arrived, I did manage to roughly tack the guard together with the original sides that I cut, and that's much better. And it matches the ones that I've got that are original but modified guards. So I was actually right in the first place. My tacking didn't go too well today for some reason. I'm getting very low on welding gas, and I don't think I spent enough time getting the edges to match up perfectly, but that's okay. There's some gaps to fill. Basically what you do is you hammer the edges together, which if there's a gap and you hammer them together, it's going to pull in, but then you can stretch it back out with the hammer and dolly on the little T-stake that you probably can't see there in the vise. But that's blocked up there now. I printed some new spacer blocks that I use as measures. These are 4-inch spacers, and 4 inches on the front, 4 inches on the back is going to work perfectly. There's plenty of clearance now at all extremes of the steering motion, and I think it'll be fine. Remember, this will get a little bit narrower once that edge is rolled over by 1/2 inch, so it'll make thinner looking guards, which is how they seem to be on a lot of cars. And being further up kind of enhances almost the low down look of the car, because the guards are effectively higher up, making the car look lower down, if that makes sense. Which is, you know, the way these cars were. They were very low slung cars. So I'm pleased with how that one's come out. I'll probably have to go out, get some more welding gas, and then I can weld that up properly. Now that I've done this a couple of times, I can do it so much faster. So that didn't take me long at all. I pre-shrunk the edges using my foot operated shrinker stretcher, which works brilliantly. That was well worth making. And then I ran the edges through my little edge rolling dies here, and then TIG welded them together. I also ran the flat strip that I cut through the wheeling machine to give it some crown. So it's not, it looks flat, but it's not flat, but it doesn't look concave. So it's just got a little bit of shape to it, and that ends up looking right. So yeah, that looks way better. It doesn't look like the front or the back is pulling in. And like I say, I will make the front a bit pointier so it's easier to get that curve, that little kick on the end down there. The reason it was quite hard here is because this is quite short. It needs to come in a bit more. But it was worth making those as a practice run, and now I'm doing it again. I can do it a lot better. And this is what I mean when I say, you know, if you were doing this professionally and making 10 cars like this, by the time you get to the last one, you'd be really, really good at it. Just done an update on the Velicet. Filming 2 different projects at once, even with my minimal approach to filming, still gets confusing. Goodness knows how people who do it properly, put my dog screen back, I don't know how people who do it properly keep track of everything. But this isn't about the Velicet, this is about the Riley. I've finished the welding on this guard, and I've done the initial quick knockdown of the welds and started hammering it up. What I've found is it helps to use the 80 grit random orbit to get rid of the welding heat affected zone. When you weld it, you get a sort of bluish blackish line where the heat has affected the metal. What I find is, because I have to stop and start my welding all the time, that line makes it hard when I'm trying to smooth off this corner when I'm hammering it on my stake to see what's going on, because the line's wavy, so it makes it look like the panel's wavy where it might not be. So hitting it with the sander first, get rid of the worst of it, and then slowly go back, and it takes me an hour or so, or a couple of hours I think, on that guard, to slowly hammer it all round, get this curved nice and the right radius and smooth, and hammer all the welds away using by planishing it down with the hammer and dolly, and also the file where necessary if there are high spots. And then later on the 80 grit takes care of the rest. So that's where we got to on the Riley.